Entschuldigung, darf ich dich kurz stören? Ich würde mir gerne mal deine Eimer leihen, wäre das möglich?
Mein Eimer.
Ja, ein bisschen drauf spielen.
Spielen mit meinem Eimer.
Ja. Ein bisschen Musik machen. Cool, danke.
Heil, nicht schlecht.
Ja? Probieren wir noch mal was anderes.
Some usual day, everything seems okay. Lights in the mirror are perfect for work. Your headphones are like a shield to the silence. But what would be if you were taking a look? Oh, another chance to change is gone. There will be new ones, but first you have to find them. This is the day, don't look away from the wings of humanity today. Cause this life is too short to waste a chance. Every evening you're watching TV, there's another misery. Only pictures and numbers you see, that you don't mind. Every day, close your eyes and go to bed. But what would be if you were taking a look? Oh, another chance to change is gone. There will be new ones, but first you have to find them. This is the day, don't look away from the wings of humanity today. Cause this life is too short to waste a chance.
Danke für den Eimer. Schönen Tag dir noch. Ciao.
Amazing, huh? Here is the first of several questions, provocative questions I'm going to ask you today. From this day forward, what would you like to do with the rest of your life? From this moment, what would you like to do with the rest of your life? My answer to this question is that I want to work to change my life, and I want to work to change the world, and I want to do it together with all of you. And if I might coin a new phrase that's been stewing in my mind right here and right now, by the time I get to my last breath, I want to be remembered as a human, flourishing activist. And my goal today is to enlist all of you to join me in that endeavor. Last Saturday, I flew to New York City to join a 3-day conference that began on Sunday and went all the way through Tuesday. Sponsored by an organization called Amplifier Giving. Here's Amplifier's homepage. Here's what it says about them. Amplifier is a network of giving circles motivated by Jewish values, inspired by change makers, making a difference around the world. And you might want to know what a giving circle is. So here is their definition. A giving circle is a group of friends, family, or coworkers who come together to give. They pool their charitable donations and decide together where to allocate their money. Amplifier is a global network of giving circles motivated by Jewish values. So this was not a Christian organization. all right? And you might recall, if you've been here for a while, that I was part of a giving circle here in Boulder called the Olive Branch Giving Circle, made up of 5 Christians, 5 Muslims, 5 Jews. And we met together for a period of time. And here's a short little video that kind of recaps that experience.
I think part of the actual beauty is that people have different lenses with how they look at things, and that everyone comes from their own particular background.
When you take the 3 Abrahamic religions, the Judaism, Christianity, and Islam,
There's not a whole lot of overlap in spending time together. And so for 6 months, we got to know each other. We realized that we all have common goals together.
and then you take the most contested piece of land that there is in the Israel-Palestine conflict.
An outsider looking in, and that seems huge.
And I think it's the only way, ultimately, that we can create a more tolerant and peaceful world is by understanding each other.
Neither side is perfect.
And sometimes it's very difficult to put into words something that is so emotional.
And it was intriguing, maybe even a little bit, I don't know if scary, but challenging. And I said, I'm in, I want to do it.
There have been sort of good, honest disagreements about what's important, what's not important.
I've heard that, $1,000 could go a long way.
When it wasn't just an issue, it was a person, and it wasn't just an idea, it was someone's experience. It's much harder to keep a prejudice.
You cannot be both curious and judgmental at the same time.
It doesn't sound like something that would be that difficult to do.
This is tough stuff. We looked at almost 20 groups and then have narrowed the list down to 6, and then tonight we narrow the list again.
Just in the impact that we've all had on each other, I feel very expanded in my consciousness by this process and enriched by the relationship that I've built with every one of you. And I feel like that has an impact.
It's a model to what relationships can be like in a future where there is peace in Israel and in Palestine.
It's hard to hate somebody if you get to know them. So we're going to be meeting again coming up soon, and this time I'm going to co-lead the group with my Jewish neighbor, Sherry Edelstein. That's why I was in New York City attending the Amplifier Giving Conference. If you're interested, by the way, in learning how to start your own giving circle, I'd love to share it with you. You can start it with your friends, your family, any mix of people. It's very exciting to hang out with people you wouldn't normally hang out with and to build community that way. And become a human flourishing activist along with me at the same time. Now, to be perfectly candid with you, those 3 days in New York City turned into kind of a game-changing experience for me. And it was there that I came up with this kind of human flourishing activist thought. The theme of the conference was why we give together. And I thought I knew something about community building because that's really where I've been hanging most of my life, building community. But I felt like I was an amateur in a sea of experts. And I learned so much about the deeper and maybe more meaningful layers of community building that never crossed my mind in all my years being in ministry. It was that challenging. As the description says on their website, Amplifier Giving Network is motivated by Jewish values, inspired by change makers making a difference around the world. Everyone attending that conference were highly motivated, extremely dedicated justice and giving advocates. It wasn't just something they do on the side, it's their life. And even though they all have lives, they all have other jobs, this isn't like a full-time job, but it's a full-time life type thing. And I felt like I was connected, like to an external hard drive as God was kind of downloading bits of information at incredible megabyte speeds. It was pretty amazing. And I found myself extremely emotional most of the time because of it. And honestly, it felt very similar to the time that God kind of downloaded all the foreshadows information to me as well. a little over 13 years ago. By the way, we're still on track to have that book in my hands by early November, mid-November, and we're currently working on the book cover, so that's kind of cool. What's it going to look like? So I had a different message prepared for today. I was moving in a completely different direction. I felt like God wanted me to do something different, and so today's message is titled, "The Gift That Liberates," and we're going to drill down on something very deep and profound, at least in my mind it is, that is far beyond the topic of giving away our money. This message is really about giving away ourselves. And before we begin, I want to share just one of the many stories about how God was working in and through me at this conference. The very first speaker, the very first session was a storyteller. And so to start off the very first session, very first thing, she said, turn to somebody sitting next to you and share a true story about yourself. And I'm thinking there, what am I going to share? Nothing was coming to mind. And so, but the very thing that popped in is that, okay, I'm going to share a little bit of something about the story that Andrew and I have about our marriage, how difficult the early struggles we had in our marriage and how we overcame them to be married 43 years. Not something I would typically lead with a stranger. And so it felt odd, but as I told this woman how we were married at a very young age, we had children right away, we were highly dysfunctional, we were like kids raising kids, and that our marriage ran into serious trouble in our 7th year, and how we separated for almost a year, I could see tears now beginning to flow down this woman's cheek. And so I just paused for a second, and I looked at her and said, I see those tears. And we just kind of sat there in silence for a few seconds, and I started back up again. And I said, we eventually got back together. We started a new journey of faith in God together. We found healing, and we've been married now for 43 years, and now all kinds of tears are running down her cheek. And so this time I said, something's going on in your life right now, isn't it? And she said, yeah. She said, I've been married just about the same amount of time that you and your wife split up. And no one knows about something going on in our marriage right now because we haven't told a single soul yet. But just before I left for this conference, my husband and I separated. It's a really hard time. And she's doing this crying like I'm crying, only she's got tears. And she said, I felt like what you just shared was a huge encouragement from God. And I knew this was going to be a special conference at that moment, okay? The verse I want to use for this message, the gift that liberates, is Galatians 5:1. It is for freedom that Messiah has come to set us free. Stand firm then. Do not let yourselves be burdened again by a yoke of slavery. Let that soak in for a second, okay? Just meditate on that for a second. Jesus died on a cross to liberate us, to set us free from anything that would limit us from a full and meaningful life. And so we should avoid at all costs anything that makes us become slaves once again. Now, since this conference was based on Jewish values, you can be certain that no one ever cited this verse or any of the verse out of the New Testament. But this verse kept popping up into my thoughts, along with the word liberation. Jesus came to set us free, but I would suggest that most of us are not really free. So here's another question for you, okay? What do you currently need to be liberated from? What is limiting you from a full and meaningful life? And I want you to keep that question in mind during this message, because whatever you might be thinking of right now, my guess is that it might change by the end of our time together, okay? See if that isn't true. Now, because we're going to dive into the deepest end of the pool together, I believe that most of us are going to discover that we don't really know what we need to be liberated from, okay? Deuteronomy chapter 24 is a huge long list of morals and ethics from the Torah. It's basically instructions on how to treat those in the world who are weaker or poor, more vulnerable than we are. And so it's addressing, taking care of aliens and strangers and homeless and the poor and orphans and widows and servants and laborers. And here's what stands out for me. Twice in this chapter, God inserts the following phrase. He says, remember that you were slaves in Egypt. This is why I command you to do these things. And so in this passage, God tells us that the motivation to help others who are less fortunate than us should stem from remembering our own season of slavery. And since the previous passage we looked at in Galatians 5:1 warns us against falling back into slavery, I want to make a not so obvious but very important connection here, okay? I want to suggest that there's a vital symbiotic connection, relationship between helping others out of their slavery and preventing ourselves from returning to slavery. Okay, I'll say it one more time. There's a really important, vital, symbiotic relationship between helping others out of their slavery and preventing ourselves from returning to our slavery. In other words, the two relationships are utterly dependent upon each other. So let me share another story from the conference that stirred this thinking in my mind, okay? During the second day of the conference, we were told to go walk around the perimeter of the room that we were meeting in because they had put up about a dozen quotes on big sheets of paper and pasted them to the walls. And so we did. We spent about 15 minutes walking around the room, and then the leader of that session said, go and stand by the quote that resonated with you the most. These were all provocative quotes on the philosophy and ethics of giving. They were all awesome, and they were all very challenging, but one really reached out and grabbed me. And so I want to tell you what it said. Here's what it said. It says, if you have come here to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. There are about 50 people present at this session, and out of those 50 people, only 4 of us came underneath this quote. And the instructions were to talk about what it meant to you personally. And so the first person shared about how they thought this quote is saying that there's this beautiful relationship that takes place between the giver and the receiver. The receiver needs something, the giver has something, and they walk down this path together. And we all said, yeah, okay, there's that aspect in it. But then I said, I think the author's going a little deeper here. I don't think the author has interconnected relationship in mind. I think she has interdependent relationships in mind. Now, everyone in my group was Jewish, so I reminded them about how God often tells us to remember how we were once slaves in Egypt when thinking about our acts of tzedakah. Tzedakah equates to acts of charity in Judaism. It's a really big deal. And so I said that I think the author is actually saying that if our relationship is only interconnected, then don't waste your time helping me. But if our relationship is interdependent, if it is a symbiotic relationship based on mutual liberation, then let's work together for our mutual benefit. In other words, the giver needs the receiver just as much as the receiver needs the giver. Our freedom is bound up in our interdependent relationship, and so giving then is the gift that liberates because it liberates both the giver and the receiver. And as soon as I said this, another woman, a different woman, standing next to me began to well up in tears. It's kind of like just hear how I make a lot of you cry every week. I hear about it all the time. I make myself cry. And she said, wow, that is such a powerful connection. And then we just all stood there in silence for this, what I can only call this very sacred moment. Well, that same woman needed to leave the conference early the next day, and before leaving, she came up and she gave me this big hug, caught me totally off guard. Nobody was hugging me at this conference. I'm the born-again Jew, by the way. Okay, so it was well known. And she looked at me and she said, I will forever be impacted by the insight you shared yesterday. And I said, not me. I didn't share it. I got that. It was a download. Who remembers the first story of a human giving something back to God in the Bible? Anybody remember the story? You got to go way back. You got to go all the way back to Adam and Eve's first two sons, Cain and Abel. Let me read it to you, okay? Genesis chapter 4. It says, in the course of time, Cain brought some of the fruits of the soil as an offering to the Lord, and Abel also brought an offering, fat portions from some of the firstborn of his flock. The Lord looked with favor on Abel and his offerings, but on Cain and his offerings he did not look with favor. So Cain was very angry, and his face was downcast. So let's stop in the Jewish tradition. Let's just ask ourselves a few questions, okay? Did God ask Cain and Abel to make an offering to him? There's no place where we see him asking. I mean, maybe he did, maybe he didn't, right? Was God just in the mood for some lamb stew? Did he need a wool sweater? Cain appears to be the first one to give to God, followed by his brother Abel. So why did God have favor on Abel's offering but not on Cain's? Did God have a higher standard for Cain because he's the firstborn? We're told that Abel's offering was from the first fruits of his flock, but we're told nothing about Cain's. It could have been his first fruits. It could not have been, right? So are we to assume that Cain's offering was somehow substandard in some way? Does God merely prefer sheep over vegetables? The text leaves more questions unanswered than it answers. But my guess is that this story has nothing to do about the difference between Cain and Abel's offering. It has everything to do between the difference of their hearts. And Cain's deep-seated anger over God's disapproval is a huge clue to this, in my mind. So let's read what happens, okay? It goes on to say, then the Lord said to Cain, why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what's right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it. Now Cain said to his brother Abel, this is like right next thing, right? Hey, let's go hang out in the field together. And when they're there, Cain murders his brother. Now he's obviously mad that God didn't show favor on his offering, and it is his anger, not his offering, that's really the deeper point of the story to connect with. God is pointing out a serious heart problem in Cain, and he warns him that what is going on in Cain's heart desires to rule over him. It wants to enslave Cain. But it seems in the story it's already too late, because Cain has already so enslaved to his things that he murders his own brother over this issue. It seems like a really extreme reaction, doesn't it? But let me ask you another provocative question. Would you consider yourself enslaved to your possessions? Let me ask it a different way. If an intruder broke into your house to steal your possessions and you owned a gun, would you use it to kill him if you had the opportunity? Are you so attached to your possessions that you would actually take another human life in order to keep them? I'm just keep drilling down here, okay? Are your possessions more valuable to you than human life? And I'm not trying to be judgmental here. I've got no stones in my hands, you can see. All right? I'm simply trying to be more philosophical here as we enter into the sometimes abstract world of morality and ethics. Jesus himself entered into that. He said in Luke chapter 6, verse 29 through 30, if someone asks somebody takes your coat, somebody steals your coat, don't withhold your shirt from them. And so if they can take your coat, give them your shirt too, right? Give to everyone who asks you. And if anyone takes what belongs to you, don't even ask for it back. Wow. Now, don't forget, this is Rabbi Yeshua, okay? Don't ever make him anything else. And that the style of rabbinic teaching is to teach in a way that forces their followers to ponder deeper insights. Kind of what I'm trying to do right now. All the great sages in Judaism taught this way, and this text is a great example of how Rabbi Yeshua using this highly effective teaching style. The deeper insight to extract from this text is not to consider how much ownership we have over our possessions, but how much ownership our possessions have over us. Cain was not a generous giver because he had become a slave to his stuff. And when faced with the reality of that truth, he chose not to be set free and find liberation. He chose to become even more enslaved by killing his brother. The story of the rich young ruler is meant to teach us this same principle. He comes to Jesus and he says, Rabbi, what good thing must I do to have eternal life? So Rabbi Jesus says, keep the mitzvot of the Torah, keep all the commandments. He goes, whoa, there's 613 of them. Which ones are the most important? So Jesus rattles off, do not murder, do not commit adultery, don't steal, don't give false testimony. Oh yeah, honor your mom and dad and love your neighbor as yourself. Of course, that just wraps them all up, right? And the man says, he's counting them off. He goes, I've done all these things. What am I lacking? And Jesus, oh yeah, there's one more thing you can do. I just thought of it. There's one more thing you can do. Sell all your stuff. Use the proceeds to help those who are less fortunate than you. And then why don't you come and follow me? Because I do that every day of my life. I am a human flourishing activist. Join me. And then the text says that the man went away sad because he had great wealth. Listen, the problem was not that this man had great wealth. Great wealth is never the problem. The problem is that his great wealth had him. Like Cain, he wasn't free. He needed to be liberated. He missed his chance that day. The story of the widow's mite falls into the same kind of liberation versus slavery in the context of giving, right? You know the story. Jesus is in the temple. He's watching people as they come and put their offering in the offering boxes. Aren't you glad we don't do this here? You know? I heard some jingling there. I like to hear crispy sounds like bills, And Jesus does. He points out the difference between the percentages that each gave. The wealthy people gave only a fraction of their wealth, while the widow gave everything, right? But don't be fooled by Jesus mentioning percentages in this passage. Giving is never about the quantity of our offering. It's about the quality of our heart. And if you haven't figured it out in this message by now, it's really not a message about giving money. It's about being generous with everything God has entrusted to us. Not just our material capital, not just our emotional capital, but also our spiritual capital as well. God wants us to be generous with things like forgiveness and mercy and justice and kindness and hospitality, and mentoring, and wisdom, and faith, just to name a few. Because if we don't freely give these things away, then we become enslaved to things like bitterness and apathy, boredom, isolation, a meaningless life, and a lack of faith. The more we give ourselves away, that we peel our hands around those things that we keep tight. The more we give ourselves away to those who need to receive the things that we have, the freer both the giver and the receiver become. If you have come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you've come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let's work together. I think this is what Jesus had in mind when he told the story in John 12:24. He told unless a kernel of wheat falls off the stem and goes to the ground and dies, if it just stays there, it just remains a single seed. It doesn't have much to offer anything, even itself. But if it dies, everything flourishes. It is for freedom that Jesus came to set us free. And what did Jesus do to set us free? He's the kernel of wheat that fell off the stalk and died. He gave up everything for us. And he set us free by giving up his life. And would it be too provocative for me to suggest that by paying off our debt, Jesus, listen to this, okay? Don't throw me out when I say it. Jesus became freer than he had ever been during his 33 years on earth as a man. What were his last words? Tetelestai. Well, he probably said it in Hebrew. Paid in full is what he cried out with his very last breath. You no longer owe me anything, and I no longer have to send out those nasty past due statements. It's a win-win. We're both liberated. And worship team can come up now. Giving is the gift that liberates. And so I thought it fitting to end this morning taking communion together. You know, one of the symbols of freedom here in our country is the American flag. The cup and the bread, are symbols of freedom. Romans 5:8 says, God demonstrates his love in this, that while we were not thinking of God, wanting God, doing our own thing, committing adultery against God, he died for us to liberate us. This is our liberation. This is our forgiveness. This is our mercy. This is our justice. This is our kindness. All wrapped up in the meaning and symbols of what communion offers to us. And so, as you come down, I'd like you to be thinking about something. Remember I asked, what is it that you need to be set free from? I wonder if it's changed, by the way. Or maybe it's just added on a few things. If you're like me, you've got several things. There are layers that God wants to peel away. Be thinking about that. Let the Holy Spirit bring those things to mind to you. He wants to inspire you to a place where you take your tight fists, whatever those things are, and just let them go. So let's stand up together. We have grape juice and wine here, and we have gluten-filled matzah, and we have gluten-free matzah. So just be aware of what you need to take here. But Father, help us, and help us get this. I don't know. I I feel like you wanted me to deliver a message like this, and I'm praying that in the same way that you spoke to me, that it's transferred to many, if not all, here today. This idea of liberation. And thank you. You are the gift that liberates. You have set us free. May we not burden ourselves under the yoke of slavery again. Set us free, Lord. Amen. And so just take the elements back to your chair and take them in your own timing. We're just going to worship all the way to the end of this morning.